So Drew, if you could do the introductions, so we'll roll through.
Yeah, absolutely. So good afternoon on September 27, Citizens Advisory Committee. I'll just name off the names that I see here. We'll start with Willard Richards from, not the League of Women's Transportation and Land Use Coalition. We have Steve Bertelbaugh from Sierra Club, Brian Albee from Sonoma County Transit, Jared Hall from Petaluma Transit, Rachel Eade from Santa Rosa CityBus, Shauna Gauze with SCTA, Tom Conlin with the Sonoma County Conservation Coalition, John Bly with Engineering Contractors Association, Tom Banning from the 3rd District, Tim Webster from SCTA's Transit Paratransit Coordinating Committee. We have Rick Lutman from the League of Women's Voters of Sonoma County. We have Chair Dennis Harder from Sonoma County Alliance. We have iPhone 2, and I think that's David Oster from the 1st District.
Yep, thank you.
And then Dana Toure with SCTA, we have Brian Ling from the 4th District. We have Kurt Nichols from the Building Industry Association, Chris Barney from SCTA, Eris Weaver from the Sonoma County Bicycle Coalition, James Cameron from SCTA, and then Orlando Ramirez from Caltrans District 4. I think that got everyone. If I missed you, please speak up.
Hearing nobody, we'll assume that's the full introduction. So are there any public comments that were received?
I did not receive any public comments.
All right. From there, let's move down to item number 7. And James, if you want to handle that, that would be great.
Great. Thank you, Chair. Drew, if you could allow me to, excellent, you're already on it. I'm going to share my screen with a brief presentation to talk about the SCTA administrative code with regard to quorums and also with regard to being able to proceed as a committee of the whole. So a little bit of background here. At the August CAC meeting, we did lack a quorum, and there was a discussion as to whether we should proceed or not with the meeting because we didn't have over half of the members of the committee. But the meeting did continue as a committee of the whole. Staff has since reviewed the administrative code more thoroughly and sees a need for it to be very explicit on advisory committee quorums as well as the ability for advisory committees to proceed as a committee of the whole. So we're looking to amend our admin code at the October board meeting. If you look at the board rules within the SCTA administrative code, there's a very clear definition on a quorum, as well as there's very clear instructions on how to proceed as a committee of the whole. Whereas then when you move to the advisory committee rules, it's not quite as explicit to define what those, whether a committee of the whole applies or exactly what a quorum is composed of. So we're recommending to mirror those rules, defining a quorum as the majority, and allowing meetings to proceed when you have, a room full of, 12 board members and 3 transit agencies and ready to proceed with informative items, but not necessarily not being able to take any action. So what you see in front of you is a couple snips from our SCTA administrative code with regard to the board rules. Right, so they're very clear on, a quorum is the majority of the members or alternates present, and then it goes into details on what a committee of the whole is, where at any regular meeting where you lack a quorum, it allows that meeting to continue, but there cannot be a recommendation or an action that comes out of that meeting. When you look at the advisory rules, like I was saying, they're not explicit, and staff's recommending mirroring those board rules. So this last slide, I essentially took those same 2 paragraphs that applied to the board rules and inserted them into the paragraphs of the SCTA administrative code that discusses advisory committees. So the language changes are, a majority of the members, instead of saying the board in this instance, a majority of the members of the advisory committee shall constitute a quorum. And then also mirroring the committee of the whole text to make it clear that these meetings can continue. There just won't be action or recommendations that come out of them. But it keeps the folks who did take the time to show up fully informed of the business that SCTA is conducting. So with that concludes my presentation, and I would pass it back to the chair.
Just for clarification, do we have the opportunity to approve the minutes of the committee of the whole as relates to August, and also then maybe as of today, whenever they come up?
So approval of minutes would be an action. So an action's would not be allowed, but what would be allowed is to, share an opinion on the record of the meeting, which is shared at this agenda. So there's a record of the August meeting that's part of this agenda, as well as a link to the video for that. And so if there was anything that you wanted to add to this record, that would be available, just not an action.
Comments from the committee?
Dennis and James, thank you for that suggested workaround. I'm wondering well, first of all, what is a majority of this committee? And because I looked over the list of all the possible seats and some are vacant. And so when a seat is vacant, does that reduce the number of members? Those kinds of questions are still, I think, open in the language that I just saw you share.
Yeah, the intention there is that vacant seats would be counted as the total number of committees. So you would take into account vacant seats. The total committee itself, I believe, Drew can correct me, it's 25 or 26. Therefore, you need that 13 to establish the quorum.
That's right.
Correct. So 25 total groups, 13 would be the quorum or the majority. And then speaking of which, Lisa Bodenfort has just arrived, which makes us at 13.
Great.
We're in.
That was a
Narrowly
great
averting the
discussion.
problem.
Mr.
All right.
Chair, can I ask a question?
Absolutely, John.
What is there a number of missed meetings where you're automatically dropped, or are we kind of loosey-goosey and allow folks to come and go as they please? And I'm just wondering if that also could be something that could kick in the future to lower the needed quorum. I see same as Tom, I'm looking at this list and, there's some that participate and others that don't. I'm good with cutting it down to those that participate, quite honestly.
As I remember, there in the administrative code, it does have an attendance requirement, and if not, then there's a solution for that. So that is in there somewhere, as I remember reading it. So based that we now have a quorum, can we go ahead and have the action item, which would be the administrative action item of approving the June 28th minutes that were attached? And then is there an acknowledgement, James, of at least the August minutes from the committee?
Yeah, it's an information item only, so an acknowledgement
Perfect.
would be appreciated. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
So if
Dennis,
I can have such a motion? Yes,
Dennis,
Tom.
I'm sorry, I don't see us as being finished in item 7. I still felt like I had a few more things I wanted to be sure we hammered out. I appreciate Lisa coming on and solving the the problem, but I do think it's likely to reoccur. And I am still concerned about the language from the board simply being pasted into our and potentially other advisory committees because of this question about vacant members. So I would just encourage staff to maybe try to work on that as before it goes to the board. I don't need to micro wordsmith it today, but I wanted to be sure I got to say that before we move on to the rest of the agenda. So thank you for your indulgence, Dennis.
So noted. Thank you. Do I have a motion for the minutes?
I move that we accept the June 28th minutes as written.
Second?
Second.
All in favor? Raise your hand or aye.
I just wanted
Opposed?
to briefly add that I thank Drew for his attention to the pronouns in there. I noticed that. I appreciate it.
Always a job well done. Okay, we're doing the vote. It was approved. There was no nays. So any abstentions? All right, we're moving forward. That's great. And then administrative was the information of acknowledging the August 30th meeting. So it was, I'm not sure if we need to have an action item on that. It's just information. So we've all noted that. And any comments about the minutes or anything relative there that anyone has any changes?
Just more praise for Drew. I think the links to the video were really helpful and the times were really helpful. So thanks again.
That format, just to add to the committee, that format, I'm kind of adopting this new way of doing my notes, and this will be the format I'll be following. So if you have any feedback, I'd be very curious on your input.
Job well done. All right, moving forward. Measure M, information, Measure M project presentation. Take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So as we do every month, we try to bring you a presentation on the Measure M recipients and that are programmed in a given fiscal year. In the past, particularly most recently in the last year or two, the Citizens Advisory Committee has expressed interest in hearing from the transit operators, even though they are not programmed. They are a Measure M recipient, and because we are intending to try to put some focus on increasing transit ridership and reducing GHG and VMT and that sort of thing, we wanted to make sure that the Measure M recipients were able to come and give you a quick rundown on how they spent their Measure M funding over the last year. So that being the case, we have with us today Rachel Eade from Santa Rosa CityBus, Jared Hall from Petaluma Transit, and Brian Albee from Sonoma County Transit. And I would probably turn it over to Brian first to start us off, and then go to Rachel and then Jared. So take it away, Brian.
All right, great. Thanks, Shauna. I'm Brian Albee, Transit Manager, Sonoma County Transit. I'm going to share my screen here. Well, I will try to share my screen. I think that's it. Okay.
We see your calendar.
Well, I have my PowerPoint up. Do you see that? Do you see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, great. Here we go. All right. Well, sorry for the delay. Yes, I'm Brian Albee with Sonoma County Transit. I'm happy to be here today to give you an update on transit. We were here, I think, last November or December. And at that time, we were just we were We were into the pandemic about 6 months. Now we're into it a year later, almost. We have increased the level of service on Sonoma County Transit from 56%, which are our lowest post-pandemic level of service in March of 2020, to 80% in August of 21. Our last schedule revisions were on August 8th. And here's just a brief summary of the changes that have been made. The direction we're going is to make things simpler. And since we've kind of reset the system from March of 2020 to where we are today, a lot of the local routes operate on the same schedules, Monday through Saturday. 3 of the intercity routes, the Route 20 that goes out to West County, the 30 that goes to East County, Sonoma Valley, and the 60 that goes up north to Cloverdale, they all operate on daily schedules. And so we don't have a separate weekend schedule. The service has been expanded a bit on the weekends to reflect what we do Monday through Friday. We introduced service on Route 42 to Rosa Academy, which the school did restart. Route 66 is now a local service in Windsor, but now operates Monday through Saturday. So with that change, we went from about 72% to 80% of our post or pre-pandemic level of service. We've seen some ridership increase. We went from 27,936 passengers in July to an estimated 37,524 in September, a 34.3% increase. Average weekday ridership, although is still low. It's the week of September 20th, last week was 1,517 total riders. Since April of 2020, our ridership has increased 111% when compared with September 2021, but it's still just 47% of the pre-pandemic level. We project by the end of January 22, ridership will be at 2,000 per weekday, a 60% increase, or 60% of the pre-pandemic ridership level. And we're hopeful that by June of 22, we'll be at 25% or 2,500 riders per weekday, 75% of our pre-pandemic level of ridership. In January, late January, the JC is supposed to be back in class service, which prior to the pandemic was about 20% of Sonoma County Transit's ridership, about 800 riders a day. That has really hurt us with them being out. And so we're hopeful that when they resume in-class instruction, we will get a good portion of the 800 riders we saw pre-pandemic. In terms of Measure M funds for fiscal year 21, we had $1,454,000, an increase over $1,312,642, which we received in fiscal year 20. Measure M funds really helped us out, both on the fixed route side and paratransit side. It helped cover lost fare revenue due to lower ridership and the absence of fare collections, which did not occur between July of 2020 and February of 21. As we move forward, we have some schedules changes planned for December 12th, which is our next collective schedule change date. The Route 24 is, I think, the last of the local routes that will go to a Monday through Saturday schedule. We're realigning Route 20 an afternoon trip to better align with Santa Rosa High School bell times. Routes 30 and 40 will receive 1 and 2 additional trips respectively, and 2 revised and 3 new trips will be added to routes 44, 48. As I mentioned, in anticipation of in-class instruction at SRJC and additional service requests from Sonoma State. With these additions, the projected level of service will be approximately 85% of our pre-pandemic level of service. However, the service looks much different than it did pre-pandemic. We are no longer operating the The smart shuttles, which we did pre-pandemic, it's a question if they may or may not come back. They were very low route ridership prior to the pandemic. There's 3 routes, the Route 38 that went from Sonoma to San Rafael, which service has been suspended. Route 22 from downtown Santa Rosa to Sebastopol, and Route 46 from Sonoma State to downtown Santa Rosa. Those routes have been suspended and will likely remain suspended for at least another year. As I mentioned, we're running 80% in terms of service hours. In comparison with what we did with the pre-pandemic level of service, the ridership is only 47%. So we're really waiting for demand to come back. I think we're poised and ready, but we just have to somewhat wait it out. So in terms of vehicles, we I think last year around this time we received 2 additional electric buses. We have 3 in the fleet now. One's in Sebastopol, one in Healdsburg, and one in Roanoke Park. We have 3 more that are on order, which will be here next April or May. And then we have 6 pending after that, which should be here towards the first part of 2023. So with that, I will turn it back to Shauna.
Thank you, Brian. We'll just move right on to Rachel Eade with Santa Rosa City Bus.
Okay.
And we'll save all the questions for the end. Thank you, Rachel.
Sure, sounds good. Just share my screen as well. All right, hang on one sec. Okay. Are you guys seeing my presentation?
Yep.
Great.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Well, thanks so much for the time today. I really appreciate it. And I'm going to be a little pushing it on my time frame. So some of these slides I'm going to go through pretty quickly, but you know, as Brian showed you, there's a lot of changes in the systems these days. It's a very dynamic time. So lots of updates. So to provide a snapshot update on current CityBus service levels, as of August, we're operating at about 85% of our pre-pandemic service hours. As Brian indicated, we've all been gradually stepping our services back up as demand has returned and as we've had the staffing ability and have come out of some of the restrictions of the pandemic. In August, we did restore pre-pandemic weekend service on Saturdays, which was something that riders were really waiting for. Increased weekday frequency on 2 of our fixed routes, reinstated some school trips, and adjusted schedules to better align with all new bell times at the middle and high schools. So it was a pretty big effort. So 4 of our 14 fixed routes remain at hourly frequency today. That's you know, twice the usual headway. I mean, typically these are at 30 minutes. So hourly is tough for the riders for sure. So we're hoping in December as well to step up again on at least a couple of those routes back to a half-hour service. And at this point for us, it's staffing dependent. We've got several bus operators in training and we're hoping we'll be able to meet that goal. We do have 2 routes that remain suspended and have been replaced by a demand responsive call ahead service. It's a dial-a-ride type service that we're using to make sure we're not stranding people in those areas. They're low density, low ridership areas like Fountain Grove, where we don't get high amount of transit ridership, but there are people who do need transit services. So we'll be looking to evolve that current sort of old school service model into something more sophisticated in the future, but we don't anticipate restoring traditional fixed route services to those areas. So in terms of the ridership impacts we've experienced, just a quick snapshot, you know, prior to the pandemic, I think all 3 systems on the Zoom today were having great years in terms of ridership. We were all seeing increases year over year. We were on track to beat our 18-19 ridership and exceed 1.9 million riders on the CityBus system. Of course, that changed very quickly in the last quarter of 1920. And then fiscal 2021 was, of course, our all pandemic year where we have hit what will hopefully be forever our lowest ridership. We are seeing increases. Ridership is recovering. We're currently at between 50 to 55% of our pre-pandemic ridership in the CityBus system, up from a low of about 25% back in the spring of 2020. We did see a 17% increase of ridership between July and August 2021 with school returning to in-person learning. This is just a fun and scary longitudinal ridership graph taking you right back from the good old days of July 2019 through a projected ridership amount for September. So we've all seen this chart before, the precipitous drop in the spring of 2020 and a slow but steady increase in the subsequent months. And we have seen an uptick and an acceleration of ridership recovery in the last couple of months. And a lot of that, has to do with reopening of the economy, but certainly schools returning back in session. So we expect to be around over 82,000 riders in the month of September. Paratransit ridership follows a very similar curve. So same precipitous drop off. We are seeing more people getting back on the paratransit system in the last few months. We still have quite a bit of capacity remaining on that system, however, at this time. So our Measure M allocation also really critical to us. We received $972,000 in fiscal 2021. That makes up about 8% of our operating budget. And that supported about 8,600 fixed route service hours in our system. As Brian indicated, Measure M, it's not the biggest portion of our operating budget, but it's really important. And especially in the last year, it was a stable source of funding, and it was funding that could be used to backfill some of our other lost revenues. So very important piece of our funding program, especially getting through the pandemic. So just to talk about a little bit where we are in our service recovery and where we go from here. I showed this last year when we were here with the CAC. This is our overall service restoration framework for CityBus. And so we've been, building towards sustainable ceiling of revenue hours, which we continue to do as our revenues recover. We're continuing to prioritize service restoration on the factors you see listed here, and with an eye towards making that restoration equitable around the city so that the cuts are shared and the benefits are shared by our ridership in different parts of the city. We are, as I mentioned, looking at new service models for our low ridership areas, evolving that call ahead service into something more sophisticated in the future, probably a new service model in our system that will be more applicable than a traditional fixed route. We're coordinating very closely with our partner transit operators as we've been doing throughout the pandemic. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the end of the presentation. And then finally, we've been using fare policy as a tool to support community and transit system recovery. And I just wanted to touch very quickly on a new program we have that's part of our, COVID recovery strategy, which the City Council adopted in May. So the council adopted an unlimited pass program for CityBus, which is modeled on the successful partnership with the Santa Rosa Junior College that Brian and Sonoma County Transit piloted, but that now all systems are participating in, where we provide universal free access to Santa Rosa Junior College students. We're expanding that concept to provide a discounted bulk rate for an entire population of participants at any entity with 50 or more participants. It could be employer, it could be an institution, residential developers, especially affordable housing developers, human services agencies, and the like. So we now have the authority to go ahead and develop these partnerships. Our first program out of the gate is a fare-free program for youth that I'll talk about on the next slide. But we also have 2 affordable housing developers that we're entering into partnerships with to provide free transit access for all the residents of those new developments in Santa Rosa. So just to touch on our fare-free program for youth, our You Are Free program was kicked off on July 1st, 2021. It is a grant-funded pilot. And I just want to thank SCTA staff for the support they provided in adjusting one of our TFCA, or helping us to adjust the TFCA scope of work to incorporate this program. We've developed it in a partnership with school districts and schools and teachers and administrators, and they've really helped get the word out about the program, and it's been going really well. Ridership is already exceeding our projections about 3 months in. And one thing we think is really exciting is that what we've seen with this program is that youth ridership recovery is happening much faster than ridership recovery in our system as a whole. So if you look at this chart, it's a snapshot of Q1 2019 in the blue and Q1 2021 in the green. And you'll see that in July, our youth ridership was about 45% of the pre-pandemic level, but by August, it was up to 77%. And by the end of this month, we anticipate that our youth ridership will be at about 95% of the pre-pandemic service level. And certainly some of that has to do with just kids being back on site for in-person learning. But we think that the free fare program, and we've been receiving the feedback that the free fare program has really significantly increased access to the transit system and interest in use of the transit system among youth. So that's been really exciting, and certainly is causing a few operational challenges here and there where we have 90 kids wanting to get on a bus after school. So that's good problems though that we're looking forward to continuing to solve. So before I wrap up, I just also wanted to take a minute on behalf of Brian and Jared and the 3 agencies to talk a little bit about the transit integration work we're doing together. And I'm sure at some point soon, coordinating with your chair and SCTA staff, that we'll be coming to do a presentation to the CAC on this effort. But just to give you a snapshot today, because it's something we're spending a lot of time on, is this integration work we're doing through the Future of Transit Ad Hoc Committee of the SCTA board. Quick little background that this is an idea that's been around and concept that's been around for a long time, discussed in 2012 MTC Transit Sustainability Project. We, of course, completed the Transportation Integration and Efficiency Study here in Sonoma County in 2019, which you've all heard about. And then with the onset of the pandemic, as we were starting to collectively work to implement some of the recommendations from the TIES study in 2019, this discussion about transit coordination integration really got elevated to the regional level through the MTC Blue Ribbon Transit Recovery Task Force, really thinking about how do we come out of this pandemic with a stronger and more integrated, more coordinated and user-friendly transit system. So SCTA's ad hoc committee was convened in October 2020. The goals set forth were to increase transit ridership as a mechanism to reduce GHGs, improve access to low-cost transportation, and reduce congestion through simplifying and enhancing the customer experience and making sure that we're using our somewhat limited public transit resources in the most effective way to encourage people to use transit. So it's been a really fantastic process. The transit operators are meeting weekly, Brian, Jared, and I, and as members of our staff, to continue to move forward integration activities in these functional areas. So broadly, how our service is planned and delivered in a more integrated way, moving towards a uniform fare policy so it's not so confusing to navigate multiple transit systems, integrating our customer service function to make it easier for people to get questions answered and understand how our systems work and interrelate, and then public information and marketing, our collateral, our websites, how we're presenting information in a consistent fashion to the public. And all of this has the ultimate goal of moving towards a unified brand for local bus transit in Sonoma County. So obviously lots more to discuss there. Probably don't have time to get into the details with you today, but it's an interesting and big effort. And just to give you a last slide here, a little sense of where we are. We've sort of wrapped up the first phase of this project, which is sort of laying the groundwork, the strategy for how we're going to become better integrated in the functional areas on the previous slides. We've moved into sort of a planning phase where we're really doing the work to build the framework and foundation for better integration. And this will include a public engagement strategy that we'll be rolling out over the next several months to engage our ridership and the public more generally in terms of what the outcomes could be of this process. And then finally, we'll move into implementing the public facing activities that will really make our 3 bus systems feel more like one system for the rider. So really exciting project, and it's just been a lot of fun to work on it with Brian and Jared and our teams, as well as SCTA staff and directors. So with that, I will wrap up and we can pass it on to Jared.
Thank you, Rachel. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. Is it showing the slide in the entire screen, or is it split?
The split. So if you go to present from beginning, it should show the entire presentation.
Let me try it one more time. All right. Any better now?
There we go. Full screen.
Awesome. All right, thank you. So we just want to give you an update on this. I think we last spoke before you in November, as was previously mentioned. And so things have changed a bit since then. This is a map of what the current Petaluma transit system looks like. As a reminder, we have 6 fixed routes that you see there, the ones that run regularly on our system. We also have 6 school tripper routes, which were suspended for a while, but are now running again over the past several months. In terms of some of the recent changes, the services that were suspended last time that we spoke are now back and running. So those are all the routes 300 series that you see there, along with Route 501, which is the West Petaluma Loop route. The trip times have been coordinated with Petaluma City Schools. We met with them to coordinate the times as well as possible since they made some modifications to that service. We've done a number of outreach events over the past year or so since we've been missing a lot of the students riding to the schools for so long. We wanted to refresh people on how the service works. We want to make sure that we're educating people who haven't had a chance to ride the system previously. We've also started the Clipper Start mean-based fare program, as has the other 2 operators. And then we've actually started doing our paratransit application processing in-house. And ever since we've done that, the processing time is reduced by over 75% for us. So in terms of the ridership for us, it's been up and down trends overall. As Rachel mentioned, before COVID, for the 4 months or so prior to that, we'd actually reduced what had been a few years worth of downward ridership, and things were looking up quite a bit. And that's really the unfortunate part of all this, is ever since COVID, around February 2020 or so, we started that downward trend, as you saw on some of the other presentations. And so fortunately, ridership has recovered quite a bit for us at this point. We're currently at 60% of pre-COVID ridership levels overall on fixed route, and that's as of July. And then for paratransit, we're actually at 80% of our pre-COVID levels. Although I should note on the paratransit side especially, that really seems quite volatile in terms of the COVID waves, like the Delta variant, things like that. It really moves up and down quite a bit. But the overall trend is one of improving ridership, getting back to where we were. As Rachel mentioned, the ridership increase from our students will be a big piece of it. We're hoping overall to have 80% of our pre-pandemic ridership by June 2022, but 73% of our system is low income. 54% of the riders are students K through 12. So right there, you can imagine that if those schools aren't in session, if they're doing all remote learning, how many riders, how many potential trips we're not able to provide. And so with that group coming back, we're able to give them the transportation they need and hopefully see an increase in our ridership again. And really with all of our systems, the ridership, the demographics, the purpose can be different than a lot of other services that you hear throughout the Bay when you hear about the overall ridership trends and things like that. For us in Petaluma Transit, for example, we do have a large proportion of low-income transit dependent riders. And so it's less people, often doing the long haul commute trips, into the city and all those things. It's people, the vast majority of our trips are intra Petaluma trips, people who have to use the bus, for their main means of transportation, whether it's going to medical appointments, whether it's going to grocery shopping, going to school, things along those lines. So it really is a lifeline service for a lot of people in our community. So in terms of Measure M, what we received in FY21 was a little less than $250,000. And I would echo also what Brian and Rachel said, is it was really vital funding to help us preserve service over the past year plus. We would have had more cuts overall to our service levels if we didn't have this funding available. We ourselves, Petaluma Transit, haven't had to lay off any staff throughout the pandemic. And I think that's attributable to having good dedicated funding sources such as Measure M and a healthy funding reserve. But just by comparison, you can see what our funding level was in the prior year, FY20, a 26% decrease on Measure M. We're a complex patchwork of funds overall, but a lot of our funding sources shifted quite a bit. Things like TDA, Transportation Development Act, and things along those lines, because they're often based on things like sales tax, diesel tax, things along those areas. So when something like this pandemic and a recession comes along, it really shifts those funding sources quite a bit. So in terms of what we've been using the Measure M funding for, it's several things. It's additional service on our major corridors, most notably Route 11, which is the east-west Petaluma connector. It's letting us run service later into the night on weekdays until 8 p.m. It's additional weekend service. It's additional funding to help look at electrification, things like doing the electrification study that we completed a couple years ago. Leveraging of additional funding sources, providing local match is one of the big elements. That was one of the selling points that we saw of the Go Sonoma measure, which of course will benefit transit very much going forward. It's helped us to do additional COVID safety protocols over the past year plus, additional masks, additional sanitizer on the bus, things along those lines. And it's make sure we provide the service the community needs, especially during times when we had large social distancing requirements that we had to fulfill. And so I won't run through all these stats, we covered these last year, but overall, a lot of these pieces that you see on here still continue to this day. So it's just a good reminder that we're still very much in COVID mode. We're looking past it, but it is very much still a reality of what we're operating in. So in terms of what's the vision going forward, and the last bullet you can see there is a real important one that I would emphasize is the funding we have now is really important because it provides the services that are on the street now, and it helps get us to a funding bridge until the Go Sonoma sales tax takes place. I believe that starts rolling in 2025. And it allows us to do additional things until then, apply for additional funds, leverage additional local funds so that we can start programs in the works now that are multi-years in the making without having a certain dedicated funding source to provide that local match element, which is vital. And so it's things you can see on your screen there, additional service on our major arterials like Washington, McDowell. We're hoping to run some additional service in West Petaluma. You may see some additional operating models, maybe like microtransit or TNC partnerships that we're subsidizing trips there. Additional connections throughout the community overall to areas that aren't well served, while still providing higher frequency on our major corridors, as we've heard quite a bit. And so I'm happy to take any questions or pass it back to Sean.
Thank you, Jared. And I would just pass it back to the chair and offer up that now would be the time to ask questions about any of the presentations that you've seen.
First of all, thank you all three for the fabulous presentation, the simplified forms, the format, and the information and data to provide it. It was really helpful, and I think all of us will take some moments to digest all that information. From there, I'm going to open it up to the committee. Any questions and comments?
Dennis, I have one question. There was a reference in the county presentation about, for lack of my word, subsidizing due to the pandemic, the loss of fare revenue. Is that a typical use of Measure M funds? Again, I'm relatively new here, so that's my first question. Is that a typical use? And second, is there state or federal monies that SCTA either has or should be applying for to offset that instead of using Measure M funds?
You're muted, Brian.
So I guess I would answer your question in with regard to the fare kind of making up the difference. Fare revenue went away from the transit system. So TDA, STA, Measure M, our other sources made up that difference while the period of, I guess, July of 20 through February of 21. At the same time, the state, and they still have relaxed the fare box recovery ratio that transit operators have to achieve. I think we have another 2 or 3 possibly years of that. And so my point in bringing that up is just that Measure M was an important source for us in kind of combating the loss of fare revenue due to ridership decreases, and then just the lack of collecting fares for 2/3 of the year. So.
Brian, just for clarification, that allocation to the transits are based on dollar amounts. It's not an expenditure requirement. It's one where they get a certain percentage of the Measure M funds and they spend it on their operations. So it's not restricted as to how they're doing it, and what they do then annually is come back and tell us how they did spend it on their operations.
Right, and like Petaluma, the Measure M equals about 9.5% of our total fixed route and paratransit ridership or paratransit expenses.
Other questions?
Mr. Chair, I see Eris Weaver and Steve Burlbow's hands up.
Either one?
Okay, let's go with Eris first then.
Okay, so my question, one of the presenters, I think it was Rachel, mentioned some routes where the fixed route was not going to happen again, but you were doing some kind of on-demand service. And I was just curious and wanting to know a little more information about how frequently is that used and what are the typical uses of that and what that looks like, since I've only ever really experienced, fixed bus routes in my transit journeys.
Sure. Yeah, good question. And, this is definitely an interim solution we have in place right now. So what we're doing is, because paratransit ridership is so significantly decreased, we have lots of capacity on that system. And so since, I believe, May 2020, when we suspended those routes, we've been offering the opportunity for people in areas that used to have fixed route service that now no longer have it. And it's primarily Fountain Grove. To call the day before they need to ride and book a trip, and that our paratransit contractor knows how to qualify them for that service. It also applies if it's a timing issue where they can't get to their destination based on, that's kind of gone away now, but we at one point had significantly reduced span of service. And so we were letting people use the service as well for sort of early morning or evening trips that couldn't be served on the fixed route system that would have been served before the pandemic. So it very much is like, sort of like if you know about like the dial-a-ride concept, you call the day before, you book your ride, the smaller bus comes and picks you up and takes you where you need to go. So it's not a high-tech real-time system, but it is demand responsive and does provide sort of a baseline safety net level of access for people. I will say that the usage is very minimal at this point. Again, we're only doing this in areas that have had very low ridership. In the last couple of years, the routes that are suspended were already low frequency kind of safety net type routes. So ridership has been low in the areas served by this call ahead service for some time, which is why, we don't think it makes sense to go back to a fixed route model. We actually think if we could evolve the call ahead service into something like a microtransit or a partnership like an Uber Lyft taxi type partnership, we could provide a higher level of mobility that's more responsive to the times people actually want to travel or need to travel, at a reduced cost than restoring a fixed route. So that's where we're intending to go with it. We actually hope to be a little farther along in developing that model by now, but it's something that we need to do some public outreach on and really understand the needs in the affected areas a little bit more. So, that's something we're looking forward to getting into this fall. So hopefully that answers your questions about that service. Okay, great.
Steve, go ahead with your question. And then Tom Conlon is next.
Yes, thank you. I enjoy hearing these presentations. I'm curious whether we're finding any of the effect of Zoom meetings and other telecommuting on the bus systems. I suspect those are hard to evaluate in our part of the world, but I'm just curious whether we've made any effort to see where this is headed over the long range. Thank you.
Well, it's an interesting thought, Steve. thought, Steve. It's nothing that we've looked at ourselves. We haven't done any sort of surveying to see the impact on increases in telecommute related to the transit service demand. But I think that's something that the on a regional level, they are taking a look at a bit more in the MTC level with some of their blue ribbon task force work, as people may be aware of that work ongoing. They're looking at kind of the continued evolving nature of transit throughout the region and how it may be impacted with varying trends going forward. So I don't know if Rachel or Brian have more thoughts or data on that, but that's kind of what we've seen.
Yeah, I don't have any data for our system, but I think if you look at Golden Gate Transit, if you look at the other more commute-oriented type services around the Bay Area, they're definitely seeing lower levels of ridership recovery that I think has been very clearly attributed to the continuation of remote work, or if people aren't fully remote, they might be half-time in the office and half-time at home. And so I think that that's going to affect every transit system in the future. I think on our system to a lesser degree, because most of our current riders are traveling to school or to jobs where they have to be on site, but I'm sure there will be some impact. You know, certainly there's City of Santa Rosa employees that use the bus, and City of Santa Rosa is now implementing a 50% remote work policy for those who are interested. So I don't have any great data, but I certainly think it'll be a factor. Brian, have any thoughts?
Yeah, I would just add that, you know, Golden Gate's ridership is way down. The ferry ridership is down. Smart is coming back, but it's down. And to lesser extent, the county transit system, you know, it may take another 3 years before this kind of fleshes out and we see what the new normal is. But I think certainly remote working and Zoom meetings and all that certainly contributes to the kind of the new reality we're facing.
Thank you. I'm always fascinated by these presentations too, and especially the opportunity to kind of compare and contrast between the different systems and the populations that each of the services serve. I'm curious about you're getting to see the impact of students and as they come on in all the systems. You're also getting to see the impact of this offering of free service. And as I recall, pre-pandemic, you did a bunch of free shuttles that were local loops in a number of different places throughout the county. Did Santa Rosa do that too? No. So
yeah, just Sonoma County Transit for those.
So Sonoma County Transit did those. Yeah. And we saw pretty good jumps in service with just that intervention. I'm hearing that Santa Rosa is now doing that in a fare free manner. And I don't think I heard a means-based method in Petaluma, but I don't think I heard a true free service. I just hope you could talk about what you're learning about how, even this is a unique time, it's not really directly comparable to pre-COVID, but are you seeing the same uptake from free, or is it a different population? It's not as responsive to the free service.
Brian, do you want to start that one off,
Well,
since you have the longest
sure.
experience with free service? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Well, you're right. We still do offer free fares on all of the local routes now that Sonoma County Transit operates. So Rohnert Park, Cotati, Sonoma Valley, Cloverdale, Healdsburg, Windsor, Sebastopol, and the river areas. So that's several of our smaller services are all free. It's really the inner city service that you pay for the county service. And so, even during the pandemic, we saw really less of a decrease on those free fare routes in the local services, although the whole service was free at the time. The local ridership really kind of, it went down, but didn't go down quite as much. And the level of service didn't change on those routes. So I don't know about going forward. We have the JC program, which is free. We have Sonoma State, which is free. We have veterans that are free, and the shuttle services. Like I said earlier, we're really just waiting for demand to come back. to really see what we have to work with. And we are seeing some increase, but we're still, for the county system, we're 47% of where we were pre-pandemic.
Yeah, and I'll just comment, I think on the local services that Sonoma County Transit implemented, I think, Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember seeing statistics that you did see a surprisingly large uptake among youth, that the percentage increases, for youth riders were even higher than for sort of the population as a whole. And I think that was kind of proof of concept for us in a way, as well as knowing that, in Santa Rosa, the youth that use the bus, demographically speaking, if we look at our survey data, they're highly, largely low income, like 88%. And so we knew coming out of the pandemic that, and hearing from schools and school districts that, families, so choice between a bus pass and food on the table, like there was a definite economic need, especially with the disproportionate impacts of the pandemic. And we felt like we could really begin to hit that. I think what we are seeing is a lot of youth who have been on the system riding, but there are new riders because we're seeing greater numbers of students at specific schools waiting for the bus and taking the bus in the morning. And we are also seeing, I think, more frequent use of the system by riders that maybe they used it to get to school, but now maybe they have the opportunity to use it to get to work or other activities. I think we are seeing through the fare free concept an expansion of usage, which is, also one of the key goals of the program. So, and Jared, I'll let you chime in.
Yeah, thank you. It's something we have planned right now to do an overall fare free system. It's something to where we have a number of programs lined up that we could potentially implement in different stages. Most notably for us, we would like to do a veterans fare program to be on the same page with Sonoma County and Santa Rosa. So that would be the next one. Possibly a youth fair program is the next piece beyond that. And in many cases, those are ones where you can implement those as additional steps, building blocks to maybe getting to a community-wide free system at some points, which may be one of the big goals, especially as we have more funding coming online, whether that's Go Sonoma funding or whatever. So that's something that's there in the long term that we'll always continue to look at. Rachel touched on a lot of the good kind of equity components and the pieces that go into play there. Usually when you do these kind of programs, what we find is people that are low income when they ride the system, when they ride, they often can only do, maybe one trip per day. They're really limited with the trips that they can take. And so a lot of the ridership increase that you usually see when you do these type of programs and other free ones is people are riding more often. Whereas before they had to do a lot of sacrifice, do I go to the store today or do I go to the doctor if I can only afford one appointment? Now maybe you can make 2 to 3 more trips than you would have otherwise. So that's one of the big pieces of ridership right there, is helping that kind of social safety net elements of helping to address transportation, which is, really kind of the number one of your top 2 expenses, along with, rent or mortgage or whatever. And so that's one of the pieces that we'll continue looking at going forward, I would say.
Just to follow up on a different topic, I appreciate all that. That was a great conversation. In terms of the Santa Rosa experiment with the use of the paratransit to address the really restricted demand up in Fountain Grove, it sounds like that's unique to Santa Rosa. We're not trying that with any of the other systems. And yet I imagine that paratransit capacity is still there on your other 2 systems. And just curious to hear if there's reasons why that experiment isn't being looked at elsewhere.
Well, in terms of the county system, we haven't done that with paratransit simply because we have lost some drivers on the paratransit side. And so while demand is down, so is the resource. And so we just simply aren't in the position to look at doing that.
Any other questions, comments? If not, I'd like to thank the 3 of you for the great presentation and the information you provided today. is fabulous. Keep up the good work. We look forward to solutions as they come forward and as you come out of this pandemic and how we address all these opportunities that face us. So thank you very much.
Okay,
That's
thanks for your
great.
time.
Thank you.
Moving on, let's go into the financial statements of Measure M. James?
Yeah, the financial statements for July and August are included in your packet. They're fairly light. We've been busy wrapping up the audits, and our auditors will be here in October to present to the committee. Be happy to answer any questions on the financials that are within the packet.
Are there any questions, comments? Again, on the income side, it's on the accrual basis, so you're looking at the income being very light, and because again, the income comes in, a couple of months later, so that's explains all that good stuff. But other than that, if there's any questions or comments, we'll be moving on.
Yeah, and there are some committee members that weren't here last month. The revenue is very strong, right? So we are increase of 13%, and that was included in last month's packet for year over year. So our estimated audited revenue is about 28.7 million for last fiscal year.
Great reminder. Yep. Good job. Moving on then from the financials, the 2021 SCTA funding programs.
Mr. Chair, did you want to have a report out on the Measure M annual reporting letters first?
Oh, I did. Did I miss that? Oh, I did. I apologize so much.
No worries.
Skipped right over that.
That's okay. It should be brief. So there is a staff report in your agenda packet that talks about it, but let me just give you a brief overview. Every year, each Measure M recipient is required to send us a letter stating how they spent their funds that they received over the fiscal year. These letters are used to compile the annual report, which is then brought before the CAC for approval to send to the board. And we try to provide a report out as our transparency efforts so that you can see everything and how it operates. So each of the programs reports out. So we receive letters from the transit operators, from the Transportation and Public Works departments that receive the local streets rehabilitation funds. And then we receive letters from any of the project sponsors that have Measure M specific projects. And there is a status of the reporting letters. We received all of the reporting letters. One letter was received late, but we have since received that annual reporting letter. So it is 100% reporting as of today, and we will be compiling that information and putting it together in an annual report that you will see, probably a draft form in December, and then hopefully yes, I believe it's in November, I think, that you see the draft, some format of draft, and then if we need another meeting, we have a special meeting in December, and then we would ask for an approval in January. Then that document would go to the board of directors. With that, I would answer any questions.
Any questions, comments? Seeing none, we'll move on then to the next agenda item being, again, the SCTA funding programs.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So in the beginning of the summer, SCTA started looking at the possibility of putting together a funding program that would consider multiple different sources of funding and program all of those sources of funding, which would cobble together just about $70 million for programming in the next 5 years. That includes federal funding and state funding and local Measure M funding and Go Sonoma funding. So we put together a strategy that was approved, and then we brought a draft application to the TAC, and then we released a call for projects in August. The call for projects was intended to collect the 5 priority projects per agency, eligible agency, which would essentially be each of the jurisdictions and each of the transit agencies. And those applications were due to us on September 15th. No, well, it was in September. September 15th was when the Measure M annual reporting letters were due. And they were very close together. So it's been a very busy couple of weeks. But the annual reporting, or the call for projects was due, and we have collected all of the projects that were submitted to us. And I'm just going to share my screen real quick so that you can see that one. I think is what I want. Hopefully you can all see my staff report here.
Yes.
Excellent. So we received about just under 60 projects, and it's actually more than 60 projects if you were to count the phases of the projects. Sometimes some of the jurisdictions have submitted a number of projects under a single title, but they are phased because they are all independently useful. So, but they are all along the same corridor or related together. So those priority projects, the jurisdictions provided us a priority so that if they're in an order, you can see them as they are listed here. That's what the jurisdictions told us were their highest priorities. So attached, you can see each of the jurisdictions has submitted a list, and then the transit agencies also submitted lists. Unfortunately, we did have a couple of jurisdictions that were unable to submit by the deadline. We got something, but not complete applications. So those applications that were not submitted by the deadline were not included in the consideration for the very first attempt at programming, which was why we had to sort of rush this. We needed to have information because the first programming action out of the gate is to program the State Transportation Improvement Program and the COVID Recovery and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act funding. And those are due, the 2022 STIP programming and the CRRSAA programming is due to MTC in October. It's actually due on October 6th. So we are trying to put together a list. The board of directors for the SCTA will not hear this item until October 11th. So SCTA will be submitting a draft list MTC as a placeholder until we can get it before the board. And then once we get the recommendation from the board, we will submit our final recommendation. So we received all of these projects, 59 projects, and that was about, it was more than $200 million. We had about $70 million to program. So obviously we can't program everything. And then if you winnow it down to the 2 programs that I mentioned, the STIP and CRRSAA, and that's not listed here in my staff report, I apologize. Those items are, so the CRRSAA funds are available and must be spent before September of 2024. They need that, and they need to be obligated. Sorry, not spent. They need to be obligated. But because it has to go before the CTC in order to get a vote, that has to be done prior to September of 2024. The STIP funding, because SCTA has been in a negative balance for the STIP for a number of years because we had programmed so much of our capacity to the Highway 101 program, we are finally in the black again to receive our STIP county share. But those funds won't be available until the outer years of the STIP, which is 25, 26, and 26, 27, those fiscal years. So the programming that has to occur is about $2.3 million for the CRRSAA funding and about $3.6 million for the STIP funding. And that final number is that final STIP number is slightly different than what was in the call for projects that was released, because it was finalized by the MTC on the 22nd last week. So we just updated that number, but we know that that is the amount that we need to program to. So with that, all of that in mind, SCTA reviewed the applications submitted and tried to find a number of projects that would be a good fit for those two programs. So they needed to be eligible for the programs that are available. They needed to be, for the CRRSAA funds, able to be delivered before 2024. So we wanted them in 2023 or before. And we needed some of the out year money to be available for programming in the later years. And we knew that we only had 2.3 million in the early years and 3.6 million in the later years to program. With that, we looked toward projects that we thought would meet at least these criteria and put together a short list. So what you see before you is a short list that is slightly modified from what was taken to the TAC, because at the technical advisory committee last week, we presented a short list and we had a robust discussion about what could be included. And a couple of the transit, we had a couple of transit projects on there, and in discussion with the transit agencies, they said that in the interest of finding projects that would deliver early and we wanted to make sure that whoever receives the funding is truly equipped to take on the fairly onerous process of getting through not only federal money, but STIP money, which means there's the extra step of having to go through the California Transportation Commission as well. Both of the transit agencies that had been included on the short list asked that we remove them from the list to be considered under all of the rest of the funding that is still to be considered and not be considered for this short list for the STIP and the CRRSAA funds. Everybody with me so far? It's been kind of a scramble. So what you see before you is a slightly modified list, and we are bringing this list to you to hear your thoughts, which we will then take into consideration as we pick a recommendation to move forward to take to the board. This also, of course, has to be done in a relatively short amount of time so that we can get it done in order to get it into the agenda packet. So with that, I would turn it back to you, Mr. Chair, for any questions and any comments that anybody would like to provide.
What an opportunity with the funding request versus the need to get it done and limited sources. From there, I'm going to open up to the committee. Any questions and comments?
I see Tom Conlon's hand raised.
Tom?
Thank you. Thank you, Shauna, for anticipating my question early on about why was Sonoma not listed at all? And last meeting, I had the same question about why the city of Sonoma had not submitted a local road safety plan. And James helped clarify that, which I later took up with City Public Works and confirmed that they do have a, I'm digressing. Anyway, but this here, it sounds like the city did get something in, although nothing that would qualify for this immediate CRRSAA and STIP $6 million, but presumably we would still be, the city of Sonoma would still be eligible for part of that additional 70 million in future calls for projects. Is that fair?
I'm afraid actually that that's not the case. So there were two agencies that submitted incomplete applications that were then submitted late. So I have them, but they are not, they were not included in consideration. And those agencies are Petaluma Transit and the County Transportation and Public Works Department for those projects that were altered. The projects that weren't altered were considered, and you can see that at least one of the Sonoma County Transportation, one of the Transportation and Public Works projects is on the list. It's actually a project that would be delivered by regional parks. That doesn't answer the question that you asked though, which is the city of Sonoma. I did call and check in with the city of Sonoma. The city of Sonoma intentionally did not submit for this call for projects. And I would encourage you to talk to the city of Sonoma about their reasons.
Thank you. That's why I'm asking. And because, you know, we're not as bad as Haiti, but we are in a bit of a failed state situation. Our representative to the SCTA board has missed the last 2 meetings, and I haven't taken the trouble to find out what's going on. But thank you for answering my question. To the projects that did submit and that you've shortlisted here, I like the looks of these projects. I'm looking primarily at the waiting to bike ped and the number of check boxes in the criteria category, especially for the CRRSAA. I'm a little surprised by the Windsor project that doesn't have that same profile, if you will, that same percentage profile and the number of, at least I'm looking at, I think it's the number of boxes checked. So I'm curious if I'm noticing a difference there with a Rada lane interchange northbound on-ramp differing very significantly from the rest of the list, and if there's any story behind that.
Sure, and that's a good question. So Arata is in Windsor, and Windsor was not did not receive funding during the quick strike, which was the most recent funding process that we went through. That's just one of the items. And what's listed in that matrix in front of you is not necessarily all that we used to evaluate the projects. Like I said, we did look toward delivery year. We looked toward eligibility for the program, particularly for STIP funds. STIP funds are very easily used on state highway system projects. And particularly if Caltrans is the one that implements the project, sometimes additional funding can be found for cost overruns. It not necessarily if it's a local agency implementing it, but on a state highway system, if Caltrans is implementing it, that is an option, which makes it sort of appealing. And as I said, Windsor did not receive quick strike funding. And that project was within the amount that was available. You can see that they're asking for 3 million and we had 3.6. So that was one of the things that really sort of popped it out. But I would agree with you that it does not check all the boxes.
Right, and these are still beyond your list. These become competitive at that next level. So
that's right.
Right. So the fact that this is included in the short list being presented to our board, there could be other worthy projects that aren't being presented that might have a better or as equal or maybe better chance.
Once we get, absolutely. And once we get through with this action of programming the STIP and CRRSAA, everything else goes back into a pot and gets reevaluated entirely based on what the other funding sources are.
Right. Great. So thank you for answering all those questions. Appreciate it.
Sure thing. Mr. Chair, I see Steve Bertelbaugh has his hand up.
Steve, please.
Yeah, you can guess my question ahead of time. To what extent does the ability of these projects to reduce vehicle miles traveled figure in the prioritizing?
I did have an eye toward that in picking the projects. And I would say that it will certainly be among the things that we consider when we make our recommendation.
Okay, that's nice to hear. It sounds to me like we're really looking at the source of funds and trying to make sure that the projects that can attract additional funds sort of rise to the top of the heap. So how do those two priorities work together?
So we did try, I did add on this list, and it's not, it is showing here. So if you look to the third from last column over here, amount leveraged, you can see is what each of the projects is bringing to the table in addition to what they're asking for, which is the amount requested in this column. And I think that based on the comments that we got from the TAC, I added that column so that the board would be able to see that as a weighted factor. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I'll look closely at this, and thank you very much.
Sure.
Any other questions?
I've got a quick one. Sorry, I didn't raise my hand properly. Shano, to what extent does municipalities' support or lack therein for the sales tax measure that was passed a while back enter into the rating system, or does it?
It does not at all.
Should it?
That is an excellent question that I can absolutely write down and bring forward. But I did not consider it in my initial evaluation.
It seems like some, a lot of this, some of the funding is derived from that moving forward into the future. So if a town, I'm not to pick on Windsor, but a town like Windsor decided not to advocate for that, should we not give a town a little more credit for one of their projects than the town that didn't want it in the first place?
So this not being measure money, I think is probably not worth it, but I can certainly take it into consideration when we do the evaluation of all the other projects, or I can say that it was brought up to us as something that should be considered.
All right, any other comments, questions? Due to the time here, we should be moving on. If not, thank you. Great presentation, great list of projects to think about and move forward. Next item, I think on the list is item number 8, which is highway discussions. James, is that up for you?
Yeah, we had a successful weekend-long closure down in Petaluma. I want to share with the committee just a little graphic of what happened over the weekend. So Highway 101 at East Washington interchange, there is a ramp that, as you can see on your screen, swung wide out and then had an intersection on East Washington, which is going up and down on the screen here. That ramp was closed for 54 hours from midnight on Friday night through Sunday morning early. Gelati Construction was able to establish the grades across the new ramp and turn on the new signal. By shifting this ramp alignment to the west, that increases your intersection spacing from where it is now located at the new ramp termini. This spacing to McDowell increased, which will increase traffic operations along East Washington. That's the biggest update for what's been happening on the highway projects. I do just want to let the committee know as well that happening here this week, later this week. We're going to have a couple different traffic switches that are going to allow traffic to switch over to the east side of the freeway and then move on with stage 3, which is all of the work that has to happen on the west side. With that, I can just conclude the highway report and the updates that have been going on Highway 101 and see if the committee has any questions they'd like to ask.
Are there any questions?
Yeah, my question is, it looks to me like Washington is under the freeway, or is it actually cross over the freeway?
Washington is it is a overcrossing. So Highway 101 goes under and East Washington goes over the top.
Okay, doesn't seem to show that way on the picture or the map.
Okay, yeah, it was just an exhibit, so a graphic representation of what's happening there, and it was focused on the Highway 101 component as opposed to the interchange itself.
I get it. Thanks.
Any other questions, comments?
I see John Bly with his hand up.
Don?
Yeah, James, any problems with the 54-hour closure that weren't anticipated and handled? That's a long closure.
Yeah, it went really great. I got a big update on it this morning about, the back and forth between the contractor and Caltrans and what have you. And there was a substantial grade difference that they had to make up across the existing ramp. So a lot of fill, a lot of base rock, a lot of paving, and it was successful. And the other part I didn't mention that I should have is that they also opened the auxiliary lane from Lakeville Highway to that realigned off ramp. So you essentially have an exit only lane. I call it auxiliary lane. That's the technical term for it, but the exit only lane. So that section of highway there from Lakeville to East Washington now has those exit only lane and then 2 through lanes.
Great, thank you.
Great. All righty. Seeing no other questions or comments, we're moving on to announcements. Are there any announcements? Seeing none, we're going to be adjourning. Our next meeting is scheduled for October 25th. And hopefully by then we will have passed a transit plan federally, and that we maybe have more discussion about federal dollars. So see how that goes. So any other questions or comments? If not, everyone have a great evening. Again, SCTA staff, great presentation, great job, and thank you for keeping us informed in the good work that you do. It's much appreciated. Thank you. Have a good evening.